Sarah had always been the type of person who couldn't walk past a stray animal without stopping. Her heart ached every time she saw abandoned pets on the streets, and her husband Mark often joked that she would adopt every homeless animal in the city if he let her. That rainy Tuesday morning in October, as she drove home from her job at the local library, she spotted a large German Shepherd mix sitting alone under a bus stop shelter. The dog was soaking wet, shivering, and looked like he hadn't eaten in days. His ribs were visible through his matted fur, and his brown eyes held a sadness that made Sarah's chest tighten. She pulled over immediately, not caring that she was already running late for dinner with Mark's parents. Something about this particular dog called to her in a way she couldn't explain. When she approached slowly with her hands extended, the dog didn't run away like most strays would. Instead, he looked up at her with those soulful eyes and let out a soft whimper. His tail gave the smallest wag as if he was afraid to hope but couldn't help himself. Sarah's heart melted completely. She could see old scars on his muzzle and ears, signs that he had been through rough times before finding himself alone on the streets. She spent 20 minutes sitting in the rain, talking softly to the dog, and letting him get used to her presence. When she finally coaxed him into her car with a granola bar from her purse, she knew there was no way she could take him to the animal shelter. This dog needed a real home, and something deep inside her told her that she was meant to be the one to give it to him. The drive home was quiet except for the dog's gentle panting from the back seat. Sarah kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching as he slowly relaxed for the first time in who knows how long. She started thinking of names for him, settling on Max because he looked like a Max to her, strong, loyal, and deserving of a fresh start in life. When she pulled into the driveway of their small suburban home, Sarah took a deep breath. Mark had always been supportive of her animal-loving nature, but they had never discussed getting a pet. Their house was neat and orderly, with white carpets and expensive furniture that Mark took pride in maintaining. She wondered how he would react to a large, muddy dog suddenly appearing in their carefully organized life. She decided to clean Max up a bit before introducing him to Mark. Using old towels from the garage, she dried him off as best she could and gave him some leftover chicken from lunch. The transformation was remarkable. Once clean and fed, Max revealed himself to be a beautiful dog with intelligent eyes and a gentle disposition. His coat was actually a rich golden brown with black markings, and despite his rough past, he had perfect manners. As Sarah led Max toward the front door, she rehearsed what she would say to Mark. She would explain how she couldn't just leave him there, how he was clearly a good dog who had just fallen on hard times, and how they had more than enough space and love to share. She was confident that once Mark saw Max, he would understand why she had to bring him home. The front door opened before she could reach for her keys. Mark stood there in his work clothes, tie loosened around his neck, looking tired after a long day at the accounting firm. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to surprise as he took in the sight of his wife, standing on their doorstep with a large, damp dog at her side. For a moment, nobody moved. Max looked up at Mark with calm, assessing eyes, his tail neither wagging nor tucked between his legs. Sarah held her breath, waiting for Mark's reaction and hoping he would see what she saw in this gentle creature, who just needed someone to believe in him again. Sarah had always been the type of person who couldn't walk past a stray animal without stopping. Her heart ached every time she saw abandoned pets on the streets, and her husband Mark often joked that she would adopt every homeless animal in the city if he let her. That rainy Tuesday morning in October, as she drove home from her job at the local library, she spotted a large German Shepherd mix sitting alone under a bus stop shelter. The dog was soaking wet, shivering, and looked like he hadn't eaten in days. His ribs were visible through his matted fur, and his brown eyes held a sadness that made Sarah's chest tighten. She pulled over immediately, not caring that she was already running late for dinner with Mark's parents. Something about this particular dog called to her in a way she couldn't explain. When she approached slowly with her hands extended, the dog didn't run away like most strays would. Instead, he looked up at her with those soulful eyes and let out a soft whimper. His tail gave the smallest wag as if he was afraid to hope but couldn't help himself. Sarah's heart melted completely. She could see old scars on his muzzle and ears, signs that he had been through rough times before finding himself alone on the streets. She spent 20 minutes sitting in the rain, talking softly to the dog and letting him get used to her presence. When she finally coaxed him into her car with a granola bar from her purse, she knew there was no way she could take him to the animal shelter. This dog needed a real home, and something deep inside her told her that she was meant to be the one to give it to him. The drive home was quiet except for the dog's gentle panting from the back seat. Sarah kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching as he slowly relaxed for the first time in who knows how long. She started thinking of names for him, settling on Max because he looked like a Max to her, strong, loyal, and deserving of a fresh start in life. When she pulled into the driveway of their small suburban home, Sarah took a deep breath. Mark had always been supportive of her animal-loving nature, but they had never discussed getting a pet. Their house was neat and orderly, with white carpets and expensive furniture that Mark took pride in maintaining. She wondered how he would react to a large, muddy dog suddenly appearing in their carefully organized life. She decided to clean Max up a bit before introducing him to Mark. Using old towels from the garage, she dried him off as best she could and gave him some leftover chicken from lunch. The transformation was remarkable. Once clean and fed, Max revealed himself to be a beautiful dog with intelligent eyes and a gentle disposition. His coat was actually a rich golden brown with black markings, and despite his rough past, he had perfect manners. As Sarah led Max toward the front door, she rehearsed what she would say to Mark. She would explain how she couldn't just leave him there, how he was clearly a good dog who had just fallen on hard times, and how they had more than enough space and love to share. She was confident that once Mark saw Max, he would understand why she had to bring him home. The front door opened before she could reach for her keys. Mark stood there in his work clothes, tie loosened around his neck, looking tired after a long day at the accounting firm. His expression shifted from mild curiosity to surprise as he took in the sight of his wife, standing on their doorstep with a large, damp dog at her side. For a moment, nobody moved. Max looked up at Mark with calm, assessing eyes, his tail neither wagging nor tucked between his legs. Sarah held her breath, waiting for Mark's reaction and hoping he would see what she saw in this gentle creature who just needed someone to believe in him again. A week passed without anyone claiming Max, and during that time, something beautiful began to unfold in their household. The dog seemed to have chosen Mark as his primary person, following him from room to room with devoted eyes and settling at his feet whenever Mark sat down to work or watched television. It wasn't that Max ignored Sarah, but there was an unmistakable preference that both surprised and delighted her. Mark, who had always been somewhat serious and focused on his career, began showing a playful side that Sarah hadn't seen in years. Every morning before work, he would spend 15 minutes in the backyard with Max, teaching him new tricks or simply throwing the ball. In the evenings, he would take Max on long walks around the neighborhood, coming home with stories about people they had met and places they had explored together. "I think he was meant to be a man's dog," Sarah told her sister Linda during one of their weekly phone calls. "You should see them together. It's like Max has been waiting his whole life to find Mark, and Mark is acting like a completely different person. He's more relaxed, more talkative, and he actually smiles now when he comes home from work." What amazed Sarah most was how naturally Mark had taken to the responsibilities of pet ownership. He researched the best dog foods, bought Max a comfortable bed and quality toys, and even started leaving work a few minutes early to make sure Max wasn't alone too long. The man who had once worried about dog hair on the furniture now had Max's leash hanging by the front door and kept treats in his briefcase. Max's transformation was equally remarkable. The scared, skinny dog Sarah had found under the bus stop had blossomed into a confident, healthy companion. His coat gleamed, his eyes were bright and alert, and his tail seemed to wag constantly whenever Mark was around. He had learned the household routine quickly, knowing exactly when Mark would come home and positioning himself by the front window to watch for his car. The bond between them became even more apparent during the second weekend Max was with them. Sarah had planned to spend Saturday organizing closets, but when she looked out the back window, she saw Mark and Max working together in the garden. Mark was planting new flower bulbs while Max sat attentively nearby, occasionally bringing Mark tools when asked or simply providing quiet companionship. "You know," Mark said that evening as they sat on the couch with Max stretched out between them, "I never thought I was a dog person, but there's something special about this guy. He's not just a pet. He's like a friend who understands everything without needing words." Sarah nodded, running her hand along Max's back as he dozed contentedly. "He chose you, Mark, from that very first night. I could see it. He looked at you like he was saying, 'There you are, I've been waiting for you.' The attachment was so strong that Max began showing signs of separation anxiety whenever Mark left for work. He would sit by the front door for the first hour after Mark's departure, then gradually settle into his routine with Sarah. But his ears would perk up at every car that passed, and his excitement when Mark's actual car pulled into the driveway was pure joy to witness. Mark started including Max in more aspects of his life. He brought the dog along when he went to the hardware store, and Max quickly became a favorite among the staff and customers. On Sunday mornings, they would drive to the park where Max could run off leash in the designated area, while Mark read the newspaper on a bench nearby. Even at the park, Max would regularly check in with Mark, as if making sure his person was still there and content. Sarah found herself falling in love with this new version of her husband, almost as much as she loved their new dog. Mark had always been a good man, but Max had brought out a gentleness and warmth that made their marriage feel renewed. He would tell her stories about his day with Max, share funny observations about the dog's personality, and sometimes she would catch him having full conversations with Max as if the dog were giving advice about work problems. The decision to make Max a permanent member of their family wasn't really a decision at all. It happened naturally, like accepting that the sun rises in the east, after 3 weeks with no one claiming him. And with Max so clearly thriving in their home, Mark surprised Sarah by coming home with official adoption papers from the local animal rescue organization. "I figured it was time to make it official," he said, scratching Max behind the ears as the dog pressed against his legs in greeting. "This guy belongs with us now. I can't imagine our life without him." 6 months into Max's life with them, the dog's devotion to Mark had grown to levels that were both touching and slightly concerning. Max had developed routines that revolved entirely around Mark's schedule, and his attachment had become so intense that he would barely eat when Mark was away on business trips. Sarah loved seeing her husband so happy, but she was beginning to worry about the extremity of Max's focus on one person. The dog would wake up every morning at exactly 6:30, 15 minutes before Mark's alarm, and would sit quietly beside the bed until Mark stirred. During breakfast, Max would position himself where he could watch Mark's every movement. And when Mark left for work, Max would follow him to the car and wait until it disappeared down the street, before reluctantly coming back inside with Sarah. What started as endearing loyalty was evolving into something more complex. Max began showing possessive behaviors that Sarah initially found amusing, but gradually recognized as problematic. When friends visited and tried to engage Mark in conversation, Max would subtly insert himself between Mark and the other person. He wasn't aggressive, but his message was clear. Mark belonged to him. The most noticeable change came during Mark's interactions with Sarah herself. Max had begun positioning himself between them whenever they sat together on the couch, and if Sarah tried to hug or kiss Mark, Max would gently but persistently nudge his way into their embrace. It was done with such sweet determination that they both laughed about it initially, but Sarah was starting to feel like an outsider in her own marriage. Mark seemed oblivious to the extent of Max's possessiveness, interpreting every behavior as proof of the dog's exceptional intelligence and loyalty. When Sarah mentioned her concerns, Mark would brush them off with comments like, "He just loves me. That's all." Or, "You're reading too much into it, Sarah. He's just a very affectionate dog." The situation reached a turning point during their monthly dinner party with Mark's co-workers. Sarah had spent all day preparing Mark's favorite meal and decorating their dining room beautifully. She was looking forward to an evening of adult conversation and the chance to show off their charming home. Max, however, had different plans. Throughout the evening, Max shadowed Mark so closely that guests began commenting on it. When Mark sat down to eat, Max planted himself directly beside Mark's chair, resting his head on Mark's lap and gazing up at him with adoring eyes. Every time someone tried to tell a story or joke that captured Mark's attention, Max would softly whine or paw at Mark's leg, effectively redirecting his focus. The most embarrassing moment came when Sarah's friend Janet complimented Mark on his recent promotion and reached over to pat his shoulder in congratulation. Max immediately stood up and placed himself between Janet and Mark, not aggressively, but with a clear message that physical contact with his person was not welcome. The room fell silent and Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. After their guests left, Sarah tried to discuss the incident with Mark, but he was surprisingly defensive. Max was just being protective, he said, settling on the couch with the dog immediately claiming the space beside him. That's what loyal dogs do. Besides, Janet was being a bit touchy-feely, don't you think? Sarah stared at her husband in disbelief. The Mark she married would never have been bothered by a friendly pat on the shoulder, especially from someone they had known for years. It was as if Max's possessiveness was somehow influencing Mark's own perceptions and behaviors. She began to wonder who was really in control of this relationship between man and dog. Over the following weeks, Sarah noticed other changes in Mark that seemed connected to Max's influence. He was less interested in their usual social activities, preferring to stay home with Max rather than go out with friends. When they did go out together, Mark would worry aloud about Max being alone and would often suggest they return home earlier than planned. Their intimate moments as a couple were increasingly interrupted by Max's presence. The dog had somehow learned to sense when Sarah and Mark were being affectionate, and he would appear at their bedroom door with a soft whine or would need to go outside urgently. Mark always responded to Max's needs immediately, often leaving Sarah feeling frustrated and neglected. Sarah found herself missing the early days of Max's arrival. When the dog's presence had brought joy and lightness to their home, now she felt like she was competing for her own husband's attention and losing. The dog she had rescued with such love and hope was somehow changing the dynamics of her marriage in ways she never could have anticipated. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had been the one to bring Max into their lives, thinking she was giving a lonely dog a loving home. Instead, it seemed like Max had decided that Mark was his property, and everyone else, including Sarah, was merely a guest in his territory. The situation reached a breaking point one evening when Sarah returned home from a girls' night out to find Mark asleep on the living room couch with Max curled up beside him. This had become their new normal routine, even though they had a perfectly comfortable bedroom upstairs. When Sarah gently woke Mark to suggest they go to bed, Max immediately opened his eyes and gave her a look that seemed almost challenging. "Let's just stay here tonight," Mark mumbled sleepily, his arm automatically wrapping around Max. "We're comfortable, and I don't want to disturb him." Sarah stood there in the dim light, watching her husband choose to sleep on the couch rather than risk disturbing their dog, and something inside her finally snapped. This wasn't just about pet ownership anymore. Max had systematically worked his way into every aspect of their relationship, and Mark was either unable or unwilling to see how problematic it had become. The next morning, Sarah made an appointment with Dr. Patricia Wong, an animal behaviorist who specialized in human-pet relationships. She needed professional perspective on whether Max's behavior was normal canine bonding or something more concerning. Dr. Wong listened carefully to Sarah's detailed description of Max's behaviors and Mark's responses to them. "What you're describing sounds like an extreme case of single-person bonding combined with resource-guarding behavior," Dr. Wong explained during their consultation. "Max sees Mark as his most valuable resource and is actively working to control access to him. The concerning part is that your husband seems to be reinforcing these behaviors rather than setting appropriate boundaries." Dr. Wong recommended a structured training program that would help establish Sarah as an equal authority figure in Max's life, and teach the dog that sharing Mark's attention was not only acceptable, but required. The plan included specific exercises for Mark to practice, including deliberately ignoring Max during certain times of day and having Sarah take over some of Max's care routines. When Sarah presented this information to Mark, his reaction was more defensive than she had expected. "There's nothing wrong with Max," he said firmly. "He's just a loyal dog who loves his family. I'm not going to punish him for being affectionate." "It's not about punishment, Mark," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "It's about balance. Max has made himself the center of our relationship, and that's not healthy for any of us, including him. What happens when we want to travel, or have children, or when Max gets older and can't be so physically involved in your daily routine?" The mention of children seemed to hit Mark differently. They had been talking about starting a family for the past year, but those conversations had become less frequent since Max's arrival. Sarah could see Mark beginning to consider the implications of Max's possessive behavior in a broader context. However, implementing Dr. Wong's recommendations proved more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. Mark struggled with the concept of ignoring Max during designated times, often giving in when the dog would sit sadly by the door or rest his head on Mark's knee with those expressive brown eyes. Max seemed to sense the change in routine and responded by intensifying his attention-seeking behaviors. The most difficult part was establishing Sarah's authority with Max. The dog had learned to view her as secondary to Mark in the household hierarchy, and changing that perception required consistent effort from both humans. Dr. Wong had explained that Max needed to see Sarah and Mark as a unified team, with both deserving equal respect and obedience. Progress was slow and sometimes frustrating. There were days when Sarah felt like they were making headway, with Max responding to her commands and seeming more relaxed about sharing Mark's attention. But then Mark would inadvertently undermine their progress by allowing Max to interrupt their dinner conversation, or by giving in when Max whined to join them in the bedroom. The breakthrough came during an unexpected incident 3 weeks into their training program. Mark came down with a severe flu that left him bedridden for several days. For the first time since Max's arrival, Sarah became the primary caregiver for both her husband and their dog. Max was initially anxious and confused by the change in routine, but gradually began accepting Sarah's leadership when Mark was unable to provide his usual attention. During those few days, Sarah saw glimpses of the dog Max could be when his world wasn't entirely centered on one person. He was more relaxed, more responsive to her commands, and even seemed to enjoy their walks together without constantly looking back toward the house where Mark was sleeping. When Mark finally recovered, Sarah was determined to maintain some of the progress they had made. The real test came when Mark returned to work after his illness. Instead of immediately reverting to their old patterns, Sarah insisted on maintaining the new routines they had established. Max would have breakfast with her before Mark came downstairs. She would be the one to let him outside for his morning routine, and Mark would deliberately spend the first few minutes after arriving home greeting Sarah before acknowledging Max. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when Sarah wondered if they were fighting a losing battle against Max's intense devotion to Mark. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamics in their household began to shift toward something more balanced and sustainable. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but by the end of their 3rd month working with Dr. Wong, their household had found a new equilibrium that worked for everyone. Max still clearly preferred Mark's company, but he had learned to accept Sarah's authority and to share Mark's attention without becoming anxious or possessive. More importantly, Mark had begun to understand the importance of setting boundaries with their beloved dog. The turning point came when Sarah suggested they test their progress by having friends over for dinner again. Mark was initially reluctant, remembering the awkwardness of their last dinner party, but he agreed to try. This time, they implemented Dr. Wong's suggestion of giving Max a special puzzle toy during meals, which kept him occupied and prevented him from monitoring Mark's every interaction with their guests. The evening was a complete success. Max remained calm and well-behaved throughout dinner, even when guests laughed loudly or reached across the table near Mark. When their friend Janet complimented Mark on his recent work project and briefly touched his arm, Max didn't intervene. Instead, he continued working on his puzzle toy, secure in his place in the family but no longer needing to guard Mark jealously. After their guests left, Sarah and Mark sat together on the couch with Max lying contentedly on the floor nearby instead of between them. It was the first time in months that Sarah felt like she had her husband's undivided attention during their evening conversation. Max occasionally looked up at them but seemed perfectly relaxed about not being the center of attention. "I didn't realize how intense it had gotten," Mark admitted as they reflected on the evening. "I thought I was just being a good dog owner, but I can see now that I was actually enabling behavior that wasn't healthy for any of us. Max seems much more relaxed now that he doesn't feel responsible for monitoring my every move." Sarah reached over and took Mark's hand, grateful that her husband was finally understanding the bigger picture. "He's still your special buddy," she said, watching Max's tail thump gently against the floor at the mention of his name. "But now he's also part of our family team instead of trying to be your only relationship." The real proof of their progress came 6 months later when Sarah and Mark decided to take a long weekend trip to visit Mark's parents in another state. Previously, any separation from Mark would have sent Max into a depression where he would barely eat or play. This time they arranged for Sarah's sister Linda to stay at their house with Max, and they prepared him for their absence by having Linda visit several times beforehand. When they returned from their trip, they found Max happy and healthy, having enjoyed his time with Linda without pining away for Mark. He was excited to see them both return, but his greeting was joyful rather than desperate. The dog, who had once been so anxiously attached to Mark, had learned that love and loyalty didn't require constant vigilance. As they settled back into their normal routine, Sarah reflected on the journey they had all taken together. She had rescued Max from the streets thinking she was saving a dog, never imagining that he would end up teaching them valuable lessons about balance, boundaries, and healthy relationships. Max's intense devotion to Mark had forced them to examine their own marriage and communication patterns in ways that ultimately made them stronger as a couple. Mark had learned that truly loving someone, whether human or canine, sometimes meant saying no and setting limits for their own good. Sarah had discovered her own strength and leadership abilities, becoming more assertive not just with Max but in other areas of her life as well. And Max had found security in being part of a stable pack, rather than trying to control and possess his favorite human. The dog sleeping peacefully in his bed near their couch was still the same gentle, intelligent animal Sarah had found under that bus stop shelter 2 years ago. But now he was a well-adjusted family member who brought joy and companionship without disrupting the human relationships around him. He still preferred Mark's company and would always be especially bonded to him, but that special connection had been channeled into something healthy and sustainable. On quiet evenings like this one, Sarah would watch Mark and Max together and feel grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought them all to this point. She had given a homeless dog a loving home, but in return, Max had given them lessons about love, loyalty, and the importance of balance that would benefit their family for years to come. Sometimes the most challenging experiences turn out to be the most rewarding, and Max's intense devotion to Mark had ultimately taught them all how to love each other better.